philosophers. Is it working? I guess it is. Good day, philosophers. Here we have a follow-up video on our brief description that sort of compared Kant and Mill. And I recorded that video years ago, but I wanted to follow up and give especially some more detail on Immanuel Kant because I think there can be some misconceptions in trying to understand exactly what Kant's philosophy is. And so we definitely want to dig deeper into his thought, especially in the concept of goodwill, like what really is a, let me move this to the side. What really is a goodwill for Kant, and what does it mean to have the right intentions? Because that's what we saw last class. We basically said that the one thing that we said about Kant is that life is all about having, morality is all about having the right intentions, right? And so this could lead to some deep misconceptions about the nature of what kinds of intentions really are good intentions, and to what extent having a good intention really makes an act good, right? And so some of the ways that we talk about someone having good intentions can be very problematic. People could say good intentions pave the path to hell, or something like that. And so we need to really examine this. But also by looking more deeply at this idea of a goodwill and its relationship to intentions, we're also going to be able to understand Aristotle much better, I think, right? And that's actually really our goal here, is to really get to understand Aristotle a little bit more deeply. We're not going to truly get Kant's philosophy here. This video is really not intended to deeply explain all of Kant. What's really intended is to help us get a better understanding of Aristotle's philosophy by contrasting him to some very important things in Kant. So very good. We're looking here at, whoops, this thing is really useless to me here. I'm just going to put it, where am I going to put it? I'll put it over here. I'm using Zoom to help me record this a little bit. But anyways, we're reading Immanuel Kant's Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. We're not reading the whole thing, just little snippets of it, right? And I have even highlighted certain parts of the text that I think that might make things a little bit easier. I'm going to move myself over here for now so we can see the text a little bit better. But let's just look at the opening line of the first section from the Grounding. There's a preface that comes before this, but in the first section, we see Kant say this very importantly, right here, where he says, there is no possibility of thinking of anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be regarded as good without qualification, except a good will. There's nothing good, nothing at all good, except fundamentally a good will. And so this is already kind of interesting for us, because this already starts to set up Kant as different from Aristotle in important ways, right? And so for Kant, the only thing that's good is a good will, right? Nothing is good except for it. It's the only thing good in itself. Good in itself. Now, if we remember from Aristotle, we had at least three things that were good by nature, right? We had what was beneficial, we had what was pleasant, and we had what was beautiful. And Kant doesn't talk about multiple things that could be good for their own sake, that are good by nature. Kant says there's only one thing, a good will, right? And okay, so what does he mean by a good will? Fundamentally, we're going to see that a good will is a will that sort of desires to fulfill the moral law, desires to let me do that. Fulfill the moral law, right? And we're going to see that this moral law is something that's fundamentally discovered through reason for Kant, right? That we can reason our way to exactly what follows by the moral laws, and we will examine a little bit of that in this video in the Kant's categorical imperative. There's many variations on it. We're only going to look at one that'll help us contrast things to Aristotle in a nice way as well too. But that we can discover this moral law through reason, and fundamentally then to have a good will is to sort of act out of duty, act out of duty in favor of doing whatever the moral law demands, right? And so okay. Let's continue here. Let's keep digging in. All right. So what does Kant continue to say here about this? Right. Well, we know that for Aristotle, he said that the highest aim, right, that even though that what's beneficial, what's pleasant, and what's beautiful are all good in themselves, he said the highest good that we seek in life is happiness. Remember that for Aristotle. It's eudaimonia. For Kant, happiness is not our fundamental end. Like we'll see here, he talks about happiness and goods of fortune and all this stuff. And he says, thus, a good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition of even being worthy of happiness. One big fundamental difference that we're going to see between Kant and Mill here, with regard to happiness, is that for Kant, right, Kant makes as a goal that we should be worthy of happiness instead of necessarily actually happy, right? He says as an end, we can't make. We will talk. He will talk about how we do have a duty to seek our happiness to some extent, but fundamentally what our aim is to be worthy of being happy and not necessarily actually happy. Now, why is that? Well, it really fundamentally comes from a certain kind of understanding of the nature of happiness and the relationship between humans and their sort of moral psychology, the interior life of a human being, right? So when Kant talks about humans, and I'll sort of just summarize stuff first, then we'll see it in the text. When Kant summarizes humans, he basically looks at us as this schism, right? So for Kant, he looks at us that there's our reason and our rationality, and then there's our inclinations, right? And he says that there's a fundamental divide between reason and inclination, right? And really that gap, that divide will never be crossed, right? You have sort of two beings within you. You have sort of your inclinations, which are just a fancy word for your desires, right? And your desires are for what all your desires are for, right? They're for, satisfaction, right? They're for pleasure, right? While reason has its own kind of recognition of what it ought to seek, right? Reason has its recognition of what's ultimately fundamentally moral, right? What is obeying the moral law. And so for Kant, that there's always going to be this tension within yourself, right? You're always going to have your passions and desires that are leading you to want to feel a certain way or do a certain kind of thing, right? You're always going to be, your hungers, your thirsts, your desires are always going to be active, right? And then reason is separate from that. Reason is just sort of your recognition of what's reason is all kinds of things, but in terms of morality, it's your recognition of what's ultimately moral and what's ultimately good. And they're constantly always in tension, right? And so for Kant, when he talks about happiness is the happiness is the total satisfaction, if I could write total satisfaction of inclination, right? For Kant, that the total satisfaction of our inclination is our happiness. And so when he thinks about the total satisfaction of our inclinations, he's going to fundamentally say, is the total satisfaction of our inclinations going to come through obeying the laws of morality that are discovered through reason? And for him, the answer is no. Reason is not very good at even trying to satisfy our inclinations. And so for Kant, we absolutely are not going to seek happiness as the full total satisfaction of our inclinations because ultimately that's just going to be the satisfaction of our desires. The true being worthy of happiness, he says that we should become the kind of person that would deserve to be happy rather than actually happy. We might not, by fulfilling the demands of the moral laws, we might not be actually making ourselves happy by doing that, but we would be the kind of people that should deserve to be happy in this world rather than all the other people that are happy, right? And so it's kind of this tension that the people that most deserve to be happy aren't necessarily happy for Kant, which is an interesting thing. So let's go back to the text and see a couple of things how this sort of plays out, right? When Kant talks about a goodwill, again, he says nothing is good except for a goodwill, right? And he says, where I highlighted here in red, he says, a goodwill is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes, nor because of its fitness to attain some proposed end. It is good only through its willing, i.e., it is good in itself. Right? So here's an interesting thing, that when Kant, in part of this emphasizing that happiness is not really our fundamental end for Kant, right? He's going to basically tell us, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit, that let me zoom in. That really the goal of our action is not necessarily to have a particular effect, right? He's going to say the effects of our actions are not important. The effects of our actions are not important, not morally speaking. So this is definitely not Mill when we were talking about Mill. Mill said that everything is about the consequences of what actually happens. But for Kant, the effects of our actions are not important, right? Not important morally, right? Why? Well, he's going to say that where do the effects of our actions come from? the effects of our actions ultimately just come from happenstance, right? What actually happens occurs in some ways through chance, right? But that seems kind of weird. If you're doing something, it's not just entirely up to chance, but just by chance. Even if you're aiming at doing the right action, things might not necessarily work out to you, right? That they have to do with chance. They have to do with laws of nature. They have to do with all kinds of other beings that are going to sort of try to get in your way of doing things. So when Kant talks about having a good will, he demands that you actually attempt to fulfill the moral law, but the attempt to fulfill the moral law is enough. Attempt to fulfill, if I can only write, fulfill the moral law is enough, is enough. It's not necessary that you are actually effective in accomplishing good ends, because the only end itself should be to completely fulfill the moral law. So if you say realize that you need to be generous with a particular person in a situation, then you ought to be generous with that person. And now if your generosity, if your generosity actually leads, I don't know what's going on here. If your generosity actually leads to good outcomes, that's great. But it's not about whether or not your generosity actually worked out. It's about the fact that you were being generous, right? And so let's go back to the text here, right? So again, it's not about what it accomplishes. It's fundamentally about the willing itself. He says, really, he connects the actual outcomes of our actions to our inclinations. He says, when it is considered in itself, then it is to be esteemed very much higher than anything which it might ever bring about, merely in order to favor some inclination, or even the sum total of all inclinations. And the sum total of all inclinations, I told you a minute ago, was happiness, right? And so, really, the effects of our actions, the effects of actions, right? There's a C in that word, if I can only write. The effects are fundamentally ordered towards our inclinations, right? And so whether or not something actually works out really is just a matter of whether it was fulfilling some of our desires or not. And fulfilling our desires, our inclinations, is not ultimately what's morally good for Kant, right? What's morally good is the willing itself. Now, when we talk about this, it might sound like that's a pretty weak passive thing. Oh, all you need to do is just have a good will and will the right intention. If things don't work out, it doesn't really matter because it wasn't entirely up to you. You know, things just don't work out by chance, and the fact that lots of people are going to be getting in your way. But Kant has this very important statement here on the next page, for us, page 8, where he says here, if with the greatest effort it should yet achieve nothing, and the only thing that will, and the good will should remain, not to be sure as a mere wish, but as the summoning of all our means in our power, yet would it like a jewel still shine by its own light, as something which has full value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither augment nor diminish its value. Now, a key thing here, now notice how I made this in pink, that when Kant talks about having a good will, it's not wishy-washy. Like he even says that it's not a wish, right? That when you have a good will, you actually are attempting to be completely effective, right? And so it's you need to summon all the means in your power. You need to truly attempt to have good effects, right? You need to really do everything that is demanded by the moral law. The moral law says you should give all of your possessions to another, then you should give all of your possessions to another out of duty and respect for that moral law, right? I'm not saying that that's what the moral law says, but if the moral law commands that, then you do it. And so it's not about whether or that really worked out for you. If the moral law says that you should give to this particular person like $20 and they use it for the wrong thing, it's not your problem. So long as you summon all the means in your power. Now, you also, though, should completely evaluate whether that would be an effective way of being generous, right? You are demanded to actually do everything you possibly can to fulfill the moral law. Just if you do truly do everything you possibly can to fulfill the moral law and it doesn't work out, then that's when Kant says your act still has moral value, right? So it's ultimately about you truly completely pouring yourself into fulfilling this moral law, right? Now, that complete unimportance then, though, of the actual effects really resides in the morality of the action. Clearly, it matters to us whether or not our actions are effective, but for Kant, it doesn't ultimately matter morally, right? Happiness cares fundamentally. Here we see Kant talking about happiness, right? Happiness fundamentally is more concerned with the effectiveness of our actions. And here Kant again sets up this distinction that I mentioned and was talking about before between ultimately happiness uh, and being worthy of happiness. And we see this distinction between reason and instinct, right? And Kant ultimately says that if we wanted to be happy and that was our fundamental goal, then we should only seek happiness through instinct alone. And reason isn't even all that good at making us happy. Now, all of this should sound very, very much not like Aristotle, right? And Aristotle talked about happiness, right? When Aristotle talks about happiness, Aristotle thinks about happiness as being this fundamentally connected to our definition of a human being, right? For Aristotle, what is the human being? But the human being is a rational animal, right? So let me get this. Let me go like this right here. And we look at Aristotle. Aristotle treats the human being as, if I could only write, this would using a graphics pen would be a lot better if I could write more neatly with it. But it's all right. You guys can make out the chicken scratches, I hope. But Aristotle talks about again, that the human being is a rational animal, right? And so if let's contrast Kant with this distinction between the reason and inclinations and what kind of we see something similar as to what happens for Aristotle and why for him being a rational animal, happiness is going to be connected to our reason, right? So while Kant sort of sets up this disparity between reason and inclinations, like that they're broken apart and they're always in tension with each other. Aristotle is going to set up this connection as being one where there's an interaction always between these, right? And so for Aristotle, we have our reason, right? We have our desires, or if we want to use Kant's words, our inclinations or our desires, but there's always this kind of going back and forth between the two, right? That for Aristotle, when we talked about the nature of virtue, we actually have this kind of training, right? This training that can kind of happen of our inclinations that it gets developed within the virtuous person, right? That reason can't simply by speaking tell the inclinations to feel something, but you can train through through practice, right? You can train through practice to sort of develop your inclinations into being a different kind of person. So and then the inclinations, they also have an effect on our reason, right? And that sometimes our inclinations can cloud our reason, but in some ways, we'll actually see that our inclinations can actually lead our reason. Sometimes you can almost through a kind of if you formed your desires and correctly, then your desire can actually help your reason see what the right action is even more quickly than your actual thinking about it. And so there can be this kind of harmony, right? Remember how we had in Aristotle, when we talked about the virtuous person, right? The virtuous person was this kind of harmony, right? Where a person's sort of their aims that they had in their life, their aim and also their desire, both aim at the same thing, right? They both aim at what is let's see, let me pick another color. What's beautiful or what's kalon, what's good, beauty. Beautiful. If I can only write, that says the word beautiful. But both of them sort of aim at the same thing, right? Now, what was the kind of character we saw in Aristotle when there was a tension between the aim and our desire? Well, that was what we called continence or incontinence, right? In incontinence or incontinence, we had this kind of tension where the aim was sort of pointing at what was beautiful, but the desire would be pointing at something else, right? And so your aim is sort of going towards what's beautiful. That says beautiful. I'm too lazy to write it more neatly. But the desire seemed to aim somewhere else. So there was this kind of tension and struggle within ourselves because our aims and our desires were not in the same place. When we think about Kant seems to set up the continent or the incontinent person really as the only option. For Kant, there is no virtue. There is no getting a harmony between our passions and our inclinations and our desires. For him, there's always going to be that fight. And so for Kant, all we're ever going to have fundamentally is continence or incontinence. We're not going to have vice where our reason and our passions, we're not going to have virtue, our reason and passions come together. We'll only have continence on one hand, or we'll only have incontinence. We'll have reason overcoming our inclinations, or incontinence, reason not overcoming our inclinations. Kant actually talks about this as an interesting about where he actually tries to talk about what the nature of duty is, right? So here Kant mentions the phrase duty. And that's ultimately what it means to act with a good will, is to act out of duty and to act according to duty, and have that's, and so Kant looks at 4 cases and tries to figure out what duty really is. And he says that it says a bunch of interesting things. You could read these here. I've got them numbered in our text as 1, 2, 3, 4. But he says clearly an action has to be in accord with duty, blah, blah, blah. But here's the third thing that Kant talks about as not being part of duty is really interesting to us. And I have it highlighted here in yellow. He says, there is a difference far more difficult to note in the third case, where the action accords with duty and the subject has, in addition, an immediate inclination to do the action. That's virtue. The virtuous person knows what the right thing is and has a desire to do the right thing. For Kant, he's saying right here in this text that that is not ultimately duty, that that's not truly moral. He's not saying that it's wrong, that that person is wrong. He's saying that that's not a moral action. He doesn't want actions to be tied up with our inclinations, right? And so what truly is duty is, as I have underlined here, acting in accordance, acting in accordance with duty and not from, my tongue was tied there again. Kant criticizes the virtuous person as being someone who might be acting in accordance with duty but not from duty. You need, to be a truly moral person, you have to be acting purely for the sake of the moral law. And so here I have underlined here, or highlighted, that the truly moral person is someone who performs an action without any inclination at all, but solely from duty. And here is an interesting kind of case, is trying to imagine what the best kind of person looks like for Kant. For Aristotle, the best kind of person, the virtuous person, has this harmony between their reason and their desires. For Kant, the best picture I kind of have of this is almost like, if you think about, if anyone's here, I zoomed way out. If you're almost familiar with Star Trek, but if you think of almost like the Vulcans, the Vulcans were supposed to be these kind of folks where there was no more passions, no more desire that sort of got in the way. It was sort of just these people who were doing pure rational calculation. And in some ways, that's almost what Kant is sounding like here, that when he talks about the truly moral person, that you fundamentally aren't letting your inclinations have a role. You just fundamentally act according to pure reason itself, right? And so again, for Kant, do you seek happiness as your end? No. You seek to be worthy of happiness. You seek to be the kind of person that would. The kind of person that doesn't obey inclination, that doesn't consider inclination when they're trying to figure out the right action. They fundamentally just do exactly what reason commands them, right? And there's something to that, because a lot of times we will see that in our own lives that there's this tension between our inclination and our reason, right? We are frequently continent or incontinent people. And so for Kant, no pun intended, when he looks at our fundamental morality, he says, let's look at the person who is like the addict struggling to do the right thing. And he says they are maybe one of the best examples you could have of morality, in the sense that they have this constant inclination to do something other than what they ought, but at the same time they overcome that constant inclination towards something else to do the right action. And for him, there's nothing sort of as a greater example of morality than that. And I think we can even take a step back and say, yes, that is truly an impressive moral feat. But then for Aristotle would say, is that the way we would actually want to live our life? Do we want to live our life in constant tension, where we constantly have our inclinations telling us to do one thing and our reason tells us another? And Aristotle says no. In fact, for Aristotle, he'll say that it's possible that those passions, those inclinations, and our reason can come together so that we can aim at the exact same kind of thing. For Kant, the best we could have is to be worthy of happiness. For Aristotle, he says eudaimonia is possible if we can allow our reason and our desires to come together as one. Hope this helps to get this one concept here. I'm going to record another video where I talk about the nature of what we intend, the nature of moral law for Kant, and how that differs in important ways from Aristotle. Have a beautiful day, and catch you on the flip side.